to understand how the system really works. So, rather than kind of relying on the design, actually seeing in practice, how does it really work? The time horizon of the board and the executive committee is radically different to the time horizon of an engineer in a sprint. However well you do at the preventative bit, there is real value in balancing that with a positive attitude towards detection and discovery, and doing that in a kind of a psychologically safe and no blame way. So.
Hello, everyone. So welcome to the GRC Engineering podcast. I'm very, very glad to have an esteemed guest with me today, Simon Goldsmith. So to kind of explain real quick, who is Simon for those of you who don't know him, he's the current head of information security at OVO. He's been working in the security industry for about 20 years now, and he worked for both public companies and also pre-IPO companies. He's also worked across numerous continents, including Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And he worked through digital transformation, which includes work with revamping one of the ISO standards for DevOps. And he's also a member of the Chartered Institute for Information Security. So, Simon, we have a great topic to discuss today. I wanted first to kind of understand within your very kind of extensive security background, how did GRC fit within your background, and some of your experience that you had either working in it or interacting with people in GRC?
Thanks, Ayu. And thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to our discussion. Wow. So kind of where did my interaction with GRC start? I think it's probably worth. If I go back, I'll go all the way back to kind of the beginning of my career, and I worked in, actually started out in Ministry of Defence working on helicopter survivability. And so started in that environment of, how do you deal with threat environments, and, in this case, it was a military platform, but how do you think about the system and the systems engineering needed to improve the survivability and ultimately the safety of the crew and of the aircraft and that sort of thing. And so I've always I guess that's my start of thinking about the mechanisms that you put in place and thinking. And we used to talk about the survivability onion. So we used to talk about the layers that you put in place to improve the chances of mission success.
Yeah. And
so I guess that really, it's a bit conceptual, but that was my kind of introduction to the idea of the contributions of governance, and although in the form of regulation or policy and military doctrine, the risk and then how do you test and or design and test for effectiveness of all of those system mechanisms. And then I got more firmly into cybersecurity and looking at securing systems. Again, kind of variety of different environments, quite a few kind of high level sensitivity confidentiality systems, where GRC and information security assurance played a really big part in being able to get a system launched and approved for use. And so, at that point, it was seen as lots of gates to pass and lots of boxes to tick. But even then, we were working in environments that were very fast moving, and people don't necessarily look at the military and national security as being kind of fast moving environments. But there are parts of it that are very fast moving and looking to adopt technology very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And so we learned in those environments, you have to have the information assurers bought in from day one. So this whole idea of bringing in those that were doing, what we would call in the private sector, second line assurance and third line assurance, bring those in early in the development life cycle. And that was a really key part of hitting some very aggressive delivery timelines and getting to what we call initial operating capability and full operating capability quickly. So I guess that was my introduction.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. I didn't know the defense sector, at least let's say in the UK in your context, like you had specific kind of area where you had this kind of, focus on speed or, that's very interesting. And I know, yeah, I know information insurance, we all know also about the federal sector in the US, all these gate are necessary, right? I think we understand the purpose. It's just that, it makes everything drag and you need to tick a lot of boxes. But I didn't know that you had this, these area was where speed was paramount.
There was, even back then there was this idea you could differentiate on being able to move at speed, but still do that, still build in security, and actually, if you did engage really on with the information assurance plan and that community and brought them along, that had real benefits for speed, but also you could make security more iterative and actually led to better security outcomes, not just better documentation.
No, that's very interesting. That's definitely something we don't really think about. So you went through the defense phase, and then you moved, I presume, to the private sector.
Yeah, so started to do more work in the banking sector, in particular, financial services, and a fair amount in national critical national infrastructure as well.
Okay.
And that's really where my international experience started. So I started getting exposed to different jurisdictions, different regulatory and policy requirements that came with operating across multiple jurisdictions, and that kind of opened my eyes to that challenge, and spent quite a few years in that space, and then I made a bit of a change. The opportunity came along to work at quite a famous global retailer. Impossible is nothing, which kind of the strap line really kind of appealed to me.
Yeah.
And that involved picking up responsibilities for Asia Pacific, and this was sort of 2019, around that time, and there's a lot of change and for those that aren't aware of kind of the regulatory requirements in that part of the world, there's a lot of different regulatory requirements, and it's a very disparate geography, but some of those regulatory requirements are quite surprising when you go into a sector that I thought I was going into, retail, which was lightly regulated. There's an increasing amount of obligations being placed on, particularly on security officers, not just from a corporate responsibility perspective, but also a personal responsibility one. So there's a couple of jurisdictions where CISOs can get held personally responsible for the decisions of ultimately of the company. And so that was a bit of a crash course in learning about how to disperse a personal responsibility and how to make sure that is you're looking out for your personal safety and well-being, as well as looking out for the company. Fortunately, that time in financial services had exposed me to work with anti-money laundering and anti-money laundering reporting officers, and that's quite a well-established space. And so I had a really good network of people I could seek advice from, emerging regulatory changes that potentially I'd need to think a little bit more about second line responsibilities than I'd thought about in the past.
Yeah, that's of course, personal responsibility of CISOs. It's been in the news recently, and I think it's very challenging. Where like you think about, you have a security team, right? But at the end of the day, like the security team has limited responsibility, and then you like work within the framework of your own organization that sets up the budget, etc. But then you can you can have personal liability on a lot of things that are completely outside of your control, which seems relatively scary, to be honest. I think you need a lot of courage, maybe a little bit of craziness to take some of these roles, I think, because of the risk involved. But I think also it's I think that's part of the what's it's both challenging, but I think rewarding as well. I think when you have a major impact, you have an impact potentially on like hundreds of millions of customers or potential end users. So I think that's the good part of it, but the potential risks. So I can understand like if you were in the Asian context and then you were able to kind of like get a crash course on understanding the potential liability you would get and kind of work with SMEs in this area. Like, you better prepare for what's coming now, which is what we're seeing, where security is so much more important than now. Like regulators, they can really pinpoint on like a breach directly on the security leadership for like one of its causes.
I totally agree, and I totally agree with everything that you said there. And I think it's important to remember the regulators are they're developing their view of how to what effective regulation looks like. And I think the biggest lesson I probably learned from it all was it's the quality of your team and your teammates, both the information security team, but the teams that you're working with, and the quality of those relationships is kind of what determines both your success and your levels of stress and ability to kind of deal with a lot of that uncertainty and kind of to your point, slightly scary external landscape that we're seeing evolve.
So went through this phase. So then you came back to Europe, or after your stint in Asia?
I certainly did, and that was kind of largely driven by COVID. Okay. So I did the role for a bit more from the UK. Through lockdown and that sort of thing, and then the opportunity came along to take up my current role, and it was kind of too good an opportunity to miss, because it's an amazing mission, and delivering a kind of a tech enabled approach to energy retail and zero carbon living is just a really awesome. It's a really awesome mission. It attracts just good human beings who care about something that's much bigger than themselves, i.e., kind of the planet and society. You've got to look after your customers who are all having many of them are having a very tough time. So as a security person, having that broader mission and knowing that you're supporting something that that has got a kind of a nobility to it is pretty cool. It's a pretty cool opportunity. So yeah, it was a bit of it was a very easy yes when the opportunity came along.
Yeah, no, I definitely. It's always good. Security in of itself is good, quote unquote, right? You're doing something that is helpful to the company overall and to its end users. But I think when you can supersede that with like a greater goal, I think it's like a 2-for-1. So it's always good. So within your career, we discussed your kind of journey. I don't need any names or any specifics, but like, what are some of the tougher kind of encounters you had with GRC teams? Or let's make it broader. Like GRC teams, you could be working with them, right? As part of your roles, but potentially auditors as well, right? On the other side, some of the challenges you've had, or some of the stuff you found a bit awkward in your time in security.
Indeed, I think there's some really good challenges that I've come across that all point to a topic that I know you're passionate about, which is GRC engineering, and so. I guess I'd characterize it in a few different ways. One, in environments that tend to be quite predictable, or at least have a lot of structure around what the expectations are from a first line, from a second line, and from a third line. So let's take big financial services as an example of that. The challenges there tend to be less about uncertainty of their roles, because people tend to be quite clear in what's required of them, and more about how do we break down those silos, because to actually deliver really effective risk reduction, and that and I think that's the challenge that I've found in those kind of spaces, is people have this predetermined, this is the job of the second line.
Yeah.
Yet your control framework will demand a whole range of improvements and security mechanisms that actually span both the first and the second line. So that kind of adamant sticking to, well, I have to be independent, I have to have an independent view and be able to scrutinize the first line, can mean you introduce a kind of a silo which actually works against risk reduction rather than supports it. I think that's one type of challenge. I think the other has been in environments where the three lines of defense are less well established. So you'd have thought you don't have that problem, and you can just actually prioritize risk reduction, and kind of the compliance bit of GRC is pushed down the list a little bit. But then you tend to have you can have some real challenges around clarity over what people are there to do and what InfoSec is there to do. And you'll walk into a room and people will automatically assume, well, these are the checkers, these are the people that are here to test whether I'm doing a good job or not, and so I will sparingly share information with them. You know, I'll only answer the questions that they ask, and you know, the kind of typical respond to an auditor type behavior. And like I say, I really firmly believe that silos are kind of the enemy of taking a systems view and understanding the system as a system engineer would. And I firmly believe GRC has a role in that overall defense of a system. So yeah, I think those are kind of a couple of high level challenges.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think for, you know, this thing where someone comes into the room and then it's very challenging for like the control owners to share information, because like it's almost as they think they have double allegiance, right? They're both from within the company and they're both kind of representing like an external auditor in some sense, because they might use that to do the testing that will then be shared with the auditors. So I think it's always this challenge when it's really true what you said, like in financial services, maybe because they also have like unlimited budgets kind of for security, right? It's like because of how critical it is for them, because of the data they hold, like they can really have those lines like well established, which is almost like unheard of in the other industries. But I think in smaller companies, and especially in like smaller security teams as well, like the lines, like you probably get the first thing, we probably get a third line to an extent, like very small internal audit team. But it's more challenging to have this, and I think often it's counterproductive, as you can explain, because then like they think the compliance instead of thinking risk reduction, because they think like I just need to share what will help us get compliant. Like they don't need to know anything else. So you know, it's where you kind of start artificially reducing the scope and stuff like this, because you know, like if they dig deeper, like they might find things that is like that are insecure, but you know, if it's not in scope for our compliance requirements, then you know, who cares?
Yeah, no, indeed. And I believe really strongly that GRC is a first line activity, hence, you know, GRC engineer as an engineering discipline. And it is the responsibility of first line control owners to govern, risk manage, and test their compliance of, you know, both design and effectiveness of their controls before the second line comes anywhere near it. And I also think that second line have a responsibility to discover ungoverned risk. And if they rely on a very predictable or a view of the system that is predictable, you're going to come unstuck for two reasons. One, tech is kind of inherently unpredictable. It evolves super quickly. Adoption, you know, the perimeter is dissolved. The adoption of commodity tech is at a pace that we've never seen before. You know, whether you kind of think back to the old days of worrying about bring your own device, and then you got SaaS, and now you've got Gen AI. So it evolves at a pace that is inherently pretty unstructured. So if you've got a very structured view of the world in the second line, you're going to have problems, and you're either going to get in the way of the business, or you're just going to get ignored and worked around.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I think we forget, or a lot of us forget, that this is there's adversaries on the other side. This isn't a complex system. You know, the level of system complexity isn't just because we've got an organization that are making lots of different decisions and are trying to drive things forward. You've got an active adversary that is actively trying to mess you up and mess with any structures and control frameworks that you put in place. So again, if you design a second line or a GRC strategy that can only deal with predictable environments, or might be complicated, but ultimately, as an engineer, you could kind of think through from cause to effect or input to output, and that's the way you view the world, you're going to come unstuck. So again, it's that, how do you make sure that everybody's on the same page with the dynamism and the fact it's a complex adaptive system, as other far greater minds than me have called it before.
No, that's very true. And I think like if you try to have like too much predictability or something that is very clear boundaries, like we see it sometimes, like you go through let's say an internal audit, or that you would ask, like, how do you control a flow of flow of traffic into your network? Like, do you encrypt it, etc.? Like, if someone works in like infrastructure security, they literally ask, like, what is our network? Like, we can't really define it like as a very set area that we can have like clear boundaries around. It's a lot more fluid, it's a lot more complex, especially with zero trust. And it's more about identity now that is about networking. And I think these like differences, if you want a very predictable environment, then it would be very predictable for attackers as well. That's what people forget. Like it's not complexity for its own sake, but I think like when you look at an environment and it's very set and very clear, I think then for attackers, it's a lot more easier to break into, just because they see patterns that they've seen elsewhere. And that make a lot of sense for them in terms of like potential attack vectors and way through which they can get in. But what you said,
I totally agree. Sorry to interrupt, but I totally agree that, and I think you bring up an amazing example of where GRC can actually educate and improve first line control owners. So let's just take network security as an example. GRC professionals are very used to categorizing controls as preventative, detective, or corrective. Quite often you'll find that those operating as a network, this isn't universally the case, but you'll find network security will think quite a lot about the preventative and less about the detective and the corrective controls, which they leave to the security folks. But actually not being able to predict what your network looks like and not being able to prevent everything and having some controls in place to discover and detect and correct is a really useful mindset to have. And similarly, we do well to kind of remind ourselves in GRC world that we can't predict everything, we can't prevent everything. So it's a good thing that we're doing both. We're both kind of building our asset inventories and building our CMDB, but it's never going to be, however great our processes are and however tightly controlled. Well, you could argue, but however well you do at the preventative bit, there is real value in balancing that with a positive attitude towards detection and discovery and doing that in a kind of a psychologically safe and no blame way. So and relying on one team to do one bit and another team to do another and one to challenge the other, I think it leads to silos rather than kind of some of those reinforcing benefits. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're right. And I think also that's where, once again, this dichotomy where, I can't see anything because I'll lose my independence. That's where, if you can help on the more of the preventative, like if you can help on the other side, and instead of only doing like the detection work, and if you can also help on this, like you're making the company more secure, which potentially makes your job easier then to properly track those risks and you work a lot more towards remediation. but then they don't want to be the remediation owners because, you know, there's the control owner who should lead the remediation effort. But I think, like, no matter what people say, I think in practice, you still have to have a little bit of that advisory role, just because at the end of the day, like, you are reporting the risks. It's not the control owner who does. So you need like both of those things to work together, right? If it's just them like figuring out on their own, and then you're like, is it working? Did you do what you said you were doing? Like, I think then like you put all of the onus on them, and it can also put a strain on that relationship, because sometimes you completely underestimate what it needs to like properly remediate or mitigate that risk. Like, it could like involve re-architecturing the whole infrastructure with some crazy things. And I think sometimes when you can like have a little bit of technical literacy, so you can understand maybe some quick wins and some areas where, you know, you can help towards having like that first little steps towards that end goal. I think then like you're seen more as like an actual ally towards getting more secure, instead of like someone who checks because they need to report to XYZ auditor afterwards.
So totally agree, and I think it comes back to viewing it as a system, and also viewing there is real value in using a GRC system to understand how the system really works. So, you know, rather than kind of relying on the design, actually seeing in practice, how does it really work? And if a GRC specialist can take a step back and say, yes, I know we design it this way, but these are the actual risks that are resulting, and these are the risks that are actually ungoverned and haven't been identified by the control owners and the first line teams, because they can't see the bigger picture, or they don't have that systemic view that we do across multiple teams and multiple functions, not just tech. You know, we're joining together, I don't know, for example, technology and HR, and we can see these gaps, or we can see these risks arising from assumptions that are being made within the teams. I think you're right, with driving real value there. And I know others have spoken about, you know, can we apply chaos engineering principles to the GRC? It's that kind of philosophy of can we use GRC as a means to really understand our organization and the business as as how it actually works, as opposed to how we designed it.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true, because you kind of have a privilege view, because you kind of have this kind of stick of kind of compliance and like reducing risks. So you have access to a lot of different areas, and like each of the individual teams, like they don't really know what the other team is doing. So the potential like 30,000-foot view, like it can really help map an actual state of how your environment looks like, instead of some of the architecture diagrams that sometimes like can be the way they were written or back when, you know, they don't really look like that in practice right now. And I think understand data flows and all these things, I think it makes a lot of sense for the other teams to better understand like the touch points, right? Like when you have APIs communicating with one another, and when the data flows from one system to another, like understanding all of these potential connections where, you know, you could have something happening in between. So that's that's definitely right. So all of this kind of leads very well into what we call GRC engineering. Could have 15 different names, but that's the name we kind of choose for this. So we kind of really explained already like a little bit of the potential skills, you know, in terms of technical literacy, kind of moving away from just being the checker to kind of having a more proactive approach with the control owners. So how would you define like what GRC engineering is in your own words? So
simply put, I think it is understanding the business and the external influences as a system, and understanding how those parts fit together, and start to model those in terms of how do they interact with each other. So, you know, how do the sources of risk, you know, whether those are threats, whether those are, you know, as we'd imagine it, you know, attackers, or whether it's, you know, kind of external factors like regulations and that sort of thing. How do they feed into and drive exposure, which I kind of quite like the use of the term exposure, is because even if you're not technical, you can get your head around exposure to risk. And then from the business side, the understanding of how your assets, your people, your business functions, your processes, and your data start to drive potential impacts, and then how do those come together in the risk, and what are the kind of the drivers, and how do you start to articulate that? How do you then start to put metrics on things? How do you start to report things? And then, what are the bits that are going to make the biggest difference? That's quite a long definition, isn't it? I think the other way I like the use of the analogy with airline safety.
Mm-hmm.
So essentially, what happened in the airline industry was there was a whole load of different changes, quite not necessarily fast moving, but the creation of an air safety regulator that was charged with both sharing information about incidents, but also driving regulation. New technologies, whether that's kind of a jet engine or kind of other kind of safety features, and then appreciation of the human factors. So the crew safety management systems, all of those kind of came together. But what happened was a really dramatic change in terms of airline safety. So there used to be this lockstep relationship between number of flights and number of crashes. But when these changes came together, that departed. So we've now got historically lowest ever crashes ever, but still increasing number of flights. So it broke that relationship, and I think that's kind of what we need, and how I see thinking of GRC as an engineering discipline is that opportunity to break the relationship between, I don't know what you call it, number of IP addresses or amount of connectivity, and kind of openness and sharing of information, and number of security incidents. I feel like that's the opportunity that we're looking to address with bringing the engineering discipline together with what has historically been quite an auditor-driven discipline. At least kind of a lot of the thought leadership has come from those with an auditing background.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, very true. Yeah, and I really like the analogy with the airline industry. Yeah, I think it made sense because, of course, like as you have like a more complex environment, you have, let's say, more VMs or more Kubernetes cluster, etc. Like if you have like the same linear progression, let's say, for potential incidents, right? Then you're not getting any better, right? Because you have more stuff open, and then as a result of it, you have more bad outcomes. So you need to kind of decorrelate those two lines. Now I get what you mean. So it like, what would you say is like, because I really like the way you explained it, the definition. You really focused on like this kind of systems thinking, right? Like really, instead of being focused on like very narrow outcomes, like really thinking of GRC as a way to understand like the technology landscape of your company and how like the GRC objectives can fit into this, but from like a broader view. What would you say is like currently the skills that are missing from GRC practitioners to get more towards this approach?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, and I'll kind of take us back to a conversation that we've just had about the potential breadth of this. And I think one of the skills is understanding and being able to make a difference and get stuff done without being overwhelmed by having to understand everything. I think that can be a real risk of, well, actually, we're going to go in here and we're going to understand the revenues, how the business generates revenues better than the chief commercial officer. We're going to understand how to operate and maintain kind of margins better than the chief operations officer. We're going to understand our people better than the head of HR. And it's just, and on top of that, we're also going to understand the threat landscape and understand how attackers attack, all of those functions that we've now understood better than people who are at very high levels, and it's just not a realistic, just not a realistic aspiration. So, and I come back to, this is why I really like your thinking about it being an engineering discipline, because as engineers, we work out how do you get that kind of thinking out of people's heads and into a system and into an engineered design. And so you're not reliant on your CISO being kind of this unicorn, unbelievably knowledgeable person who understands the business better than anybody else in the business and also understands the attackers. So it's that skill of translating, I think, this really big, quite conceptual picture into a readily understandable system of control, which also recognizes the business objectives. That's kind of one skill. But I don't know whether the job spec for that has been written yet. But you look at some good CISO job specs, it's probably not far off that, right?
True.
And then I think it's having some good understanding of having those fundamental understandings of actually how do those things of external factors like regulation, like threat actors, like external policies, how does that interact with internal policies, and then how do those help with those sources of risk and articulating the risk, and then what are the things that are going to make the biggest difference? Is it the regulatory body? Is it your kind of your policy better matching systems as designed rather than kind of as imagined? Is it being able to put metrics on things and report things so people just make better decisions because they better understand how their behaviors and their decisions impact others? And it's kind of, I think there's a skill in really determining, really prioritizing what's going to make the biggest difference and how that fits in with the context of the organization.
That makes a lot of sense. Like I think I really agree, because if you think about the way GRC is done now, we rely a lot on documentation, right? Or like screenshots and things given to us by others, right? Or information we can pull literally from, like, let's say the IM policy. And I think it's tougher for like GRC practitioners to like get one level below and kind of understand, because like when we think about metrics and reporting, like you can't scale if you base your metrics on screenshots, right? You need like an automated way or somewhere through which you can actually use software to get that data on how your systems are operating. And if you can't get like one level below, of course, as you said, we don't need to be an expert, like, like it's not jack of all trades, master of all. You actually need to be focused on like the areas that matter. But I think it's just about having the right tools in the tool belt to do that little bit of extra work that can get a really outsized benefit for like your understanding your risk posture. Because like if you're like a little bit of your technical skills like limit you in terms of what you can pull, then you have a very, very biased view of your environment, right? Like, and also I think it creates a bit of like healthy accountability for control owners, because if you can have a full view of their system, they're less likely to come in and like share the screenshots of what they actually want to share with you, because now they know you can actually check the API yourself, like make those calls and kind of get that dashboard. So they're more aware of the scrutiny around their system, so they probably make like more systemic decisions that will impact everything instead of focusing only on what's in scope for external certifications.
I think it's an empowerment thing as well. It's very disempowering when somebody comes and tells you something about your system that you didn't know. So if you're working off shared data and working off a shared set of health metrics for that system, and whether whether you decide, and I think it's quite important to differentiate around activities which add value on a periodic basis versus activities which add a lot of value continuously. We don't have to do continuous monitoring of everything, but continuous monitoring of some things actually provides an awful lot of value to those who operate those systems, and will give them, there's some good proxies that security metrics can have for just general health of the system, and will play out in terms of overall engineering quality and reliability and kind of scalability of the system. So I think it's finding those wins as well is really key.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I think you also need to an extent, like, sell it, right? Like, find what's in it for them as well, so they're more on board. And I think if you can frame it in a way that, some of the output from those activities like help also like the way they do their work, then it's more likely for them to get on board and kind of, work towards collaboration instead of, these little bit of frictions that we see sometimes.
This is why I like our conversations, right? I think it's the word that's popped into my head is abstraction. And that's, I think that is a skill, that ability to abstract information to the level of the decision maker and the time horizon of that decision maker is a real skill. And I think that's probably something that will make it onto a job description of a GRC engineer, of abstracting the information to the right level for the person to be able to action it.
Yeah, very true, very true. Because at the end of the day, if you think about like the GRC team, like a lot of their output gets often up to board level, right? So it's you always have to get like this kind of balance between like understanding more the technical controls and then being able to kind of frame it in a way that makes sense for like technical stakeholders that are often also potential decision makers. So I think this kind of split, but I think often we get too much on one end, I think, and then we kind of lose some of the relationship we could build with the engineering counterparts, because at the end of the day, like, they will help get like your posture better. So that's also kind of striking the right balance. Maybe it means like having different roles for different individuals, and then they can like openly share and communicate information, because as you said, like everyone, like one person can't do everyone's job, but it's always good to have like that mix of skills, which I think the GRC engineering practice like kind of brings that like kind of more that skill set that bridges the gap a bit more with the engineering counterparts, because we all know those tough conversations or those tough walkthroughs sometimes with the control owners, where they think we could literally like pull all the information you need in 2 minutes, and then we go through this 1 hour call when we discuss like each detail of the policy.
Look, it comes back to, and I thought it was a cracking question earlier about challenges. And I think, we talked about different languages and kind of talking the language of the business versus language of technology, or the language of the board versus the language of the engineer. But the other challenge that happens a lot, and I found this when I was looking a lot at and working threat intelligence, was time horizons. And the time horizon of the board and the executive committee is radically different to the time horizon of an engineer in a sprint. And so, and that goes for kind of GRC as well, that the time horizons for some of that information is going to be at the level of, it's at the sprint level. You've got to be talking, these are your priorities for the next 2 weeks. Versus, with a product owner or something where the time horizon might be a quarter. These are the priorities for the next 3 months, versus, next level up, which is a year, and then the board, which is probably looking, year to 18 months, maybe even further out. And it's providing that view and be able to match the time horizons of the people you're providing the information to. That's a key skill that intelligence analysts are taught to develop, that I don't think we teach to other parts of information security, about how do you make your information that you're providing relevant and actionable, and time horizons is a key one.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, that's actually very true. Yeah, because like if you think in 2 weeks, like then potentially in GRC you might think in a yearly cycle, let's say for ISO surveillance audits or for SOC, potentially quarterly or yearly for the risk as well. And I think that's where also like good relationship with the product management team is also key, right? Because they kind of set the workloads for the engineers during the sprints, and they kind of have their yearly roadmap. And I think being able to have like some input in terms of, potentially like a very small allocation specific to, like, say, control remediation. But you have to have this good relationship with the product leadership to get these prioritized, because often if you just like come up to an engineer and say like, you should focus on this, like this is related to a major risk, they don't really set their own kind of schedule in a way. Like they work autonomously, but the overall things they're working on are set during the kind of sprint if they follow agile. But even if it's a bit more loose, because some companies now like kind of move away from agile, like even if it's more loose, they still have like a specific feature or something they're working on. So I think it's always good to really focus on building this relationship with product, because they're kind of the CEO of the specific part of the company they work for. And if you build those good relationships and kind of make them understand a little bit of work on security can yield like incredible results, instead of being in firefighting mode and doing that nonstop for 2 weeks because we had an incident. So I think that these relationships also are key, and understanding how product thinks, I think is helpful, and it comes a lot to like around timelines. I think timelines is, as you said, I think understanding like we don't work in the same cycles, it's really helpful.
And this, you work in a tech-enabled company, or a very tech-forward company. You're not speaking with people here where the language barrier is really the technology. Most of the time, the language barrier is actually around time horizons.
Yes.
And how do we do prioritization? That's so specific and so contextual to a company of how do they prioritize things.
Absolutely. And it sometimes it's also cultural, right? I think like sometimes, like if the leadership worked in security in previous roles and stuff, like they can have a different kind of appetite for security that can like then translate into, let's say, the product department. But like if this culture is maybe less prevalent, then you have to build it, right? You have to kind of have those meetings, building out relationships. Sometimes, it's as easy as like, showcasing the potential bad outcomes of like that could have happened to competitors and stuff like this. Like sometimes, if you work in product, your goal is to beat your competitors on your product. So if you kind of use some of the competitors to showcase like, they were not focusing on this enough, and this happened, and this led to like this impact on, revenue or like reputation, this can sometimes have a big positive outcome. It might be a bit cheeky to use this, but
not a fan of that, if I'm honest. I think there's always positive stories to kind of lean into.
Yeah, you're right.
That tends to be the go-to. I think going down the kind of the negative, it's throwing shade it's never turned out well for me. So I do tend
you're right. I think FUD is not like the right way. It's just that, security, sometimes the only way to prove it is by the negative, right? Like nothing happened, so we're secure. And it's this dichotomy where you're protecting something against like something that it has not realized yet. And sometimes the only way to showcase is to actually show when it's realized how it looks like. So it will not be throwing shade, but I think sometimes it's like a wake-up call, because like when you see someone from the red team and what they can do, like super impressed on like how a very little amount of information can literally like, destroy a whole company. And
I think so. And I think that's the key, is to turn it into a view of positive, of how do we make success more likely. There's some fantastic work available in kind of the world of investment management, and they talk about minimize the downside risk, the upside will take care of itself. And we can talk about, look, this is what we're doing, and this is what we have done demonstrably to minimize the downside risk. We've built up our preventative capabilities, we've built up our detection and our response and our recovery and our learning, our ability to learn from the near misses and the data that we've got, and our ability to look over the horizon and anticipate what might happen to us because it's happened to others, and we've seen it in all of those stories and actually quite measurable improvements of capability.
Yeah.
You know, I'll come back, it's a system, and you can talk about your changing posture in each of those pillars. And that's why I prefer to talk to kind of senior leadership about those capabilities that we have. And I don't tend to spend a lot of time actually talking about a theoretical risk amount, or, you know, are we within or outside of kind of appetites and tolerance. It tends to be much more about how well we're doing in these built capabilities. How does that, and this is how much it might cost us to change and improve that number and improve that metric. And I think that it's a slightly more powerful, you feel like you're in control a little bit more, and you're, you know, I use sporting analogies quite a lot, but it comes back to kind of controlling the controllables. So, you know, when you're playing a sport, all you can control is the quality of your training, the quality of your preparation. You can't control the weather on the day, and you can't control your opposition. And, you know, we're in a similar world. We can control our exposure. We can make decisions about our amount of exposure. We can make decisions, and we can influence our own people and our third parties, but we can't control or influence the bad guys. I mean, there's deception, so there's elements of which we
you're right.
That, but essentially all we can do is anticipate. So being really clear on what we can control and how good a job we're doing on those controllables, I think is a really good picture to be painting by the GRC team.
No, you're right. Yeah. What you said completely makes sense. I think focusing on what you actually can control, like, makes it a lot more, like, then it's not about like variables that are, you know, you have no like grasp on but could potentially impact you. It's more about like, this is what I've done to make this better. And as you said, like, you bring it again like from within your realm. So then like it's your actual efforts that are like kind of scrutinized, instead of like things that you can't really control but could impact you. But at the end of the day, like, you know, if you focus on these, like, you won't go nowhere, right? Because
our goal is, you know, and our ultimate goal isn't necessarily to win a match.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's because, you know, the result is just the outcome. That's not who we are and how good a job we've done. It's an ongoing, you know, are we still swimming at the end of the day? To use a Simon Sinek quote, it's an infinite game. Are we able to kind of keep our heads above water, keep swimming and keep succeeding? And so focusing on like what drives success as opposed to those negatives is a pretty key thing for me.
Yeah, no, that's very true. So I wanted to kind of conclude. I wanted to ask you if you could, so it's a bit of a funny question, if you could like solve one problem in GRC like this, what would it be, and why?
I'm going to pick a behavior. So if I could solve, and I'm not saying this is my current situation, because it's certainly not, but I have encountered it before, of being judgmental rather than curious. I think that is a behavior I've seen in GRC, of going in and being judgmental either about before they've seen the evidence or once they've seen the evidence, rather than asking the question, you know, why are we seeing this? I think that would be the one thing that I'd probably, if I could click a finger and solve it, it's that make GRC curious rather than judgmental.
Wow, that's very powerful. I love this. I really think it goes back to what we said about different lines of defense, and I think it's I think it's really, I think the inquisitive mind, sometimes it can be a bit blurry between judgmental and curious. And I think like being curious both helps you understand more, but also like potentially be more useful. And yeah, that's very good. I love this. This is very good. And then like the last question would be, if there was like, let's say from our overall conversation, let's say I'm like someone, I work in GRC, and I want to move more towards like this kind of GRC engineering approach and systems thinking that we described. Like, if I could do one thing right now that would get me closer to that end goal, kind of this first step, what could it be?
I think that's super contextual.
That's true. That's actually true.
I think I'm just trying to think what I'd love to see. See, I'm a very visual person. I like pictures of systems and designs of systems. That's kind of how I operate. So when my team bring me a picture of how they think a system works, however imperfect, and they're willing to kind of get challenged on it, that I think that's awesome when I see that. I love that kind of this is how we think things are behaving and think things are kind of set up, and then they go off and test that hypothesis with me and with other stakeholders. I love those kind of conversations.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so it's focused more like having good view of your system and starting with like understanding like the current state, and then kind of challenging it with other stakeholders that might have like different pieces of information.
Yeah, 100%. And kind of getting into that, even though GRC is often seen as the challenges in the organization, also being a little bit problem solving. I think that starts to move into that space, which is great.
Yeah, very true. Yes, it's been a very good conversation. I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I'm very confident this will bring a lot of benefit to GRC practitioners and also people outside of GRC that are a bit more curious and around how the industry is moving. So yeah, I want to really thank you for your time and all of the insights.
As always, it's been a super fun conversation. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. Take care.